While LA burns, Gavin Newsom is sipping wine in Napa Valley. Kamala Harris is now seriously considering running for California governor. We have a constitutional amendment that was proposed by California way back in the day for a one world federal government. And, well, that and much more on tonight's episode of the California Underground Podcast, starting right now. What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the California Underground Podcast. I am your host, Phil, the most trusted podcast for all things California politics. Welcome to the show. Thank you to everyone tuning in live wherever you are, YouTube, Rumble, X, Instagram, Facebook, literally everywhere. Okay, so everywhere. If you got comments or questions, make sure you put them in the chat. I'll get to them in a little bit. We have a lot to cover tonight. We got four big stories happening. We got Newsom losing to President Trump again in the Ninth Circuit. We have him also sipping wine while LA burns. Kamala Harris is now seriously moving closer to running for governor of California. And Senator Scott Wiener wants to revoke all calls for a constitutional convention under Article 5. And one of the calls for a constitutional convention in California may be a little, shocking. Maybe not so shocking. I don't know. But before we get started, make sure you like, share, subscribe, review, all that stuff. That definitely helps with the algorithm. And that helps us grow the show. So, first topic right off the bat tonight. Gavin Newsom again losing to President Trump in the Ninth Circuit, this time regarding the National Guard. So if you need a little bit of a backstory, there was the LA riots, everything was going crazy, the riots and violence, and everything was happening down in LA. And President Trump, in order to protect federal agents and federal personnel in federal buildings, federalized the National Guard on June 7th. Now, Gavin Newsom, who doesn't like his authority questioned, decided that he was going to make a big show about this and sued in federal court to get control of the National Guard again. Excuse me. And it's not going so well for old Gavin Newsom. He just suffered another loss where they said, yes, President Trump can maintain control of the National Guard. We're going to get into that, and we're going to break it down a little bit by little bit. So I apologize already if it's a little legal wonky, but I kind of want to walk you through what happened here and what the court said, because when this stuff happens, I always think it's great to kind of sit down and read the opinion. I'm also like a constitutional law nerd, so I really like reading the opinions and seeing what they have to say. It was pretty succinct. Succinct for me. I think it was like 30 pages, so it was pretty easy to get through. But let's get started on some of the points that they made. So this is the breaking news, the tweet that came out. A federal appeals court has indefinitely blocked Judge Breyer's order to put Gavin Newsom back in control of the National Guard. The three-judge panel, which included 2 Trump and 1 Biden appointing, was unanimous. So 3-0 against Gavin Newsom. Let's get into part of the opinion. So this is the statute that gives the president authority, is Federal Code 12406. And the statute provides whenever the United States or any of the Commonwealths or possessions is invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation, there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or the president is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States, the president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states. And that's very important, that language, through the governors of the state. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Or in the case of the District of Columbia, through the commanding general of the National Guard of the District of Columbia. So let's see what else they had to say. They go on to say the protesters threw objects, including Molotov cocktails, and vandalized property. According to the declaration submitted by defendants, those activities significantly impeded the ability of federal officers to execute the laws, affording appropriate deference to the president's determination. Conclude that he will likely acted within his authority in federalizing the National Guard under 10 U.S.C. 12406. So that's the statute. Here's the parameters. Basically, if it comes down to the federal government cannot enact laws, or it makes it very difficult to enact laws, or they need to quell a rebellion, then the president can call up the National Guard. He can quote what they say, federalize the National Guard for the use of the commander in chief. And it goes on to say, assuming, and this is one of my favorite legal words, if you ever want to use this at like a cocktail party or something like that. It says, assuming arguendo that plaintiffs were likely to prevail on their claim that defendants violated the statute's procedural requirement, the proper remedy would be injunctive relief tailored to defendants' failure to issue the order through the governor, not an injunction prohibiting the president from exercising his lawful authority to call up the National Guard. All right, let's break that down for a quick second. Remember, I said in that statute, it said through the National Guard or through the governor's office. That's one of those things in the legal world where you get down to the nitty gritty of what does through mean as opposed to by the governor. So Gavin Newsom's whole argument is that President Trump didn't have the authority, or he didn't do this correctly, because he basically just went ahead and did it. So what happened was on June 7th, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, issued a memorandum to what they call the Adjutant General, who is the guy who is in charge of the National Guard here in California, works in the governor's office. He is part of the governor's office. They issued a memorandum that they were calling up the National Guard to protect with the federal personnel and to protect federal buildings because there was all these issues. So when that happened, the Adjutant General read it and said, okay, I'm just going to cede my authority to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. That's what we're supposed to do here. President Trump took over, and that became part of the issue. That will probably be a part of this larger lawsuit, because it really comes down to, as unsexy as it sounds, it really is going to come down to procedure and whether or not it was supposed to be through the governor's office, which, what does that mean? Or does it have to be by the governor? And that's what I think it's all going to come down to. So Newsom is suing over the fact that his authority was basically usurped by the President of the United States under this federal code. So let's go on to the next part. Goes on to say, we also note that California's concerns about escalation and interference with local law enforcement at present are too speculative. We do not know whether future protests will grow due to the deployment of the National Guard. One of the arguments that Newsom made was, well, calling up the National Guard is going to cause and further flame a lot of tensions in LA that's already kind of bubbling over. So calling up the National Guard made it worse. If you remember, basically after Trump called up the National Guard and federalized the National Guard, they were all on TV. Newsom, Karen Bass, Democratic congressmen, senators, all of them were on all these news networks saying he's inflamed the tensions by calling up the National Guard. He's made it worse by calling up the National Guard. They tried to make that part of their lawsuit. They tried to say, well, by him doing this, this was the harm. By him, this is the harm that we need emergency TRO relief for, is we need the National Guard back. Otherwise, it's going to continue to inflame these protests, and it's going to get worse and worse. So the president made it worse, not better. What the court here is saying is way too speculative. That is way too speculative for you to say that the National Guard was the reason that there were these riots and protests. Again, the court didn't really take that into consideration. They're looking at the statute and they're applying the facts to the statute. And I want to take a step back really quick. Where we are at in the process, there was a quick TRO in the trial court, or what they call the district court in federal court. It was then upheld that President Trump could use it. They appealed it, or I'm sorry, reverse that. The district court said that President Trump had to return the National Guard to Governor Newsom. They appealed it, went back to President Trump. Now this is part of that appeal. The appeal said Nope, President Trump gets to keep the National Guard under his authority for now, and that's where we're at. So the case hasn't heard its whole way out. It's probably going to be a while until we hear the actual what happens here. Maybe it just gets dismissed. Who knows? I wouldn't put it past Gavin Newsom to quietly dismiss this and go away so he can stop suffering so many losses. But that's where we're at in this process. And that was part of their argument, was there's irreparable harm that California is going to suffer if we don't get our National Guard back. So I wanted to talk about this really quick because Gavin Newsom, you know, the master politician, the master snake oil salesman, had to spin it. He had to spin what was a clear loss into his favor. And, you know, I read the entire opinion, made these highlights, and I'm showing them to you. I read the whole opinion, and it is pretty conclusively a win for President Trump, not for Gavin Newsom. And somehow he managed to make it all about him winning. So quickly after this was dropped, after the court order, almost within like literal minutes, Gavin Newsom was posting all over social media, taking a victory lap about how he had won, about how they had stood up to President Trump, that he is no king. As it goes on to say, the court rightly rejected Trump's claim that he can do whatever he wants with the National Guard and not have to explain himself to a court. The president is not a king and is not above the law. We will press forward with our challenge to President Trump's authoritarian use of U.S. military soldiers against citizens. Here's the issue there, old noodles. You lost. The statute is pretty clear. 10 U.S.C. 12406 says the president can, when it makes it hard to enact federal laws, and in this case, there were the ICE raids going on. They were trying to conduct these immigration, law enforcement raids or arrests. They were trying to do what they were supposed to do or what they were ordered to do. These protests and riots were making it hard to do. They were throwing objects at a lot of the federal law enforcement, Molotov cocktails, concrete, all of this stuff. So what did the president do? Under that statute, he said, I'm going to federalize the National Guard and I'm going to protect our assets and our people. And that's what he has the right to do. And the case goes on to say that it's likely the defendants, in this case, President Trump, are going to win. Right? That's why they upheld this, because based on the standards of an injunction or temporary restraining order, what they call TRO, it's likely the defendants are going to win because they don't really see what the argument is here. The president has the authority. There's the statute. And again, sure, they can get into the weeds of should it be through the governor's office or should it be by the governor? Is that who they should coordinate with? And I think they're probably going to argue this whole thing about the memorandum went to the adjutant general. The adjutant general stepped aside and said, okay, now the National Guard is yours. You can do what you want with them. And Gavin Newsom didn't like that. He didn't like people questioning his authority. He didn't like Trump coming in and taking his National Guard away from him. So what was the only thing he could do? He could sue. He's making this whole stink about this. And then he goes on to social media and he posts stuff like this that is a blatant lie that he did not win. And I don't see anywhere in this summary or in the case opinion where it said the court rightly rejected Trump's claim that he can do whatever he wants with the National Guard. I didn't get that anywhere from the entire opinion that he can do whatever he wants. Trump just followed what the statute said, and he did what the statute said, and the court said, yeah, he did what the statute allows him to do. We're going to give him the deferential treatment of this is what the president can do under federal law. And that's the end of it. And we're just going to keep this stay in place, and President Trump can keep the National Guard under his authority until this is all kind of worked out. But what's really kind of the saddest thing is, while I know people who are watching this or are listening might be celebrating that Gavin Newsom got another loss in the Ninth Circuit at the hands of President Trump, I will say this. We should all be a little disappointed that all of these lawsuits are being paid for with our tax dollars. So all these monumental losses that, remember, there was a story a little bit ago that got about the tariffs, and they sued about the tariffs, and they got kicked out of court immediately because they didn't check something as simple as jurisdiction. Like Rob Bonta, the top attorney, supposedly the top attorney in all of California, our attorney general, didn't figure out whether jurisdiction was proper or not. Now he's suffering more losses over the National Guard. But this is all part of a $50 million taxpayer-funded fund that they put aside specifically just to sue President Trump. So I think the biggest point that you should really be upset about is that he keeps losing and we keep paying for his losses. And this is going to keep going. And whatever he can do, he's going to keep suing over and over again. So, all right. That was that story. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're in the chat, make sure you hit up the chat with any questions or comments. We got a lot of stuff to get to. So excuse me while I take a sip of water. All right. Next story. California. I'm talking to you right now. Have we not suffered enough already? I'm looking plainly into the camera right now. Have we not suffered enough with everything that's been going on in California? Between wildfires, homelessness, the economy, and everything that we are facing. Have we not suffered enough to get this type of news that Kamala Harris is now seriously, not just thinking about it, she is seriously thinking about running for governor of California. And this is really kind of terrifying. And the fact that she is seriously considering, she was kind of on the fence. It didn't sound like she was excited. But all I can say is Kamala Harris is now seriously running for governor. And this is all I can say to that.
No, God, please, no, no, no.
So it was reported in The Hill that Harris is giving it a serious look, meaning that sources close to her are now reporting that she is gone from kind of on the fence and not so, kind of wiggly here and there. Now she's seriously considering it. She gave herself a deadline that by the end of the summer she's going to announce. And it seems like she's moving ever so closely to running for governor of California. And I want to take a moment and just remind the people who are watching and listening about the Queen of Cringe herself. And just there's a little compilation that we have, courtesy of On Demand News on YouTube. So I'm going to watch a little bit of this.
I grew up understanding the children of the community are the children of the community.
In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap.
You need to get to go and need to be able to get where you need to go to do the work and get home.
You need to get to where you need to go.
We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
I don't know what's wrong with you young people. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context.
I'm a gun owner. Tim Walz is a gun.
I did not know that.
If somebody breaks in my house, they're getting shot. Sorry.
Yes. I hear that.
Probably should not have said that.
But
my staff will deal with that later.
Who doesn't love a yellow school bus, right? Can you raise your hand if you love a yellow school bus, right? Just, there's something about and most of us, many of us went to school on the yellow school bus, right? Yells on the bus, go round and round.
She loves her school buses, right?
I just got,
I do believe that we should have rightly believed, but we certainly believe that certain issues are just settled. Certain issues are just settled.
Clearly we're not.
No, that's right, and that's why I do believe that we are living, sadly, in real unsettled times. It is the Caribbean nations, island nations. In the Western Hemisphere, that is where the Caribbean is. We are also in the Western Hemisphere. They are our neighbors. And
I'm sorry, the Caribbean nations are in the Caribbean and they are in the Western Hemisphere, which is where we are, which is where the Caribbean nations are. Thank you for that clarification.
Talking about the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time.
Significance of that.
So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do to lay these wires, what we need to do to create these jobs. I think it's very important, as you have heard from so many incredible leaders, for us at every moment in time, and certainly this one, to see the moment in time in which we exist and are present. First and foremost, I believe that we gotta take this stuff seriously as you are, because you have been forced to have to take it seriously. So you're now no longer are you necessarily keeping those private files in some file cabinet that's locked in the basement of the house. It's on your laptop, and it's then therefore up here in this cloud that exists above us, right?
Up here in this cloud. Literally, up in the cloud. Like there's
Before
clouds
I
up
begin,
there.
I do want to say a few. When we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles and reduce population, more of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water. As a United States Senator, I was proud to co-sponsor, and then as Vice President, it was my honor, with the President. The United States shares a very important relationship, which is an alliance with the Republic of North Korea. A future where we can see what is possible, unburdened by what has been. We have dreams. We can see what is possible, unburdened by what has been. I can imagine what can be and be unburdened by what has been. You know? Who saw what could be unburdened by what had been.
Unburdened by what has been.
I love Venn diagrams. I really do. I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles. And I like to think about a lot of things in the context of a Venn diagram. I love Venn diagrams. Always
those
ask,
Venn
is there a Venn diagram for this? I'm telling you, it's fascinating when you do. So Venn diagram, those three circles, right? I asked my team to do a Venn diagram of where these attacks are happening. So voting rights, women's reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights. And of course, there was a huge intersection. Sometimes people will open the door for you and leave it open. Sometimes they won't. And then you need to kick that door down.
Sometimes they leave it open, sometimes they don't.
Excuse my language.
Sometimes they leave it open, sometimes they don't leave it open. Okay, I think we get the point. I'm sorry to everyone who I made you sit through that. That was, I felt like we needed to do that because we needed to be reminded of exactly what California is up against if Kamala Harris ends up running, right? If she ends up running and winning here in California. So I think it's very important that we kind of take a step back and we kind of just watch all those videos and we go, oh, okay, it's only been 6 months, but that's what we're up against here in California if Kamala Harris runs. Now, she would be probably the number one contender, I would say, especially in the Democratic Party. Katie Porter would not be very happy about this. Katie Porter, who is running, I think she's running for governor of California. Every time I see one of her commercials, she's basically running against President Trump. This was from Real Clear Politics, which goes on to talk about a poll that was conducted, whether or not she should run for governor. And this was in April, so, a couple months old, 2 months old. Harris is currently leading a slate of hypothetical candidates with 31%. However, voters were evenly split on whether she should run for governor, with 50% saying she should and 50% saying she should not. Among Democrats, 74.7% said she should run, but among independents, 54.5% said she should not. Even 24.4% of voters who voted for Harris in the 2024 presidential election said they did not want her to run for governor. So, not great numbers for Kamala Harris. In that sense, even though she would be, I think that she would be obviously the biggest name recognition because, let's face it, there's not many people can even name all the people who are running for governor right now. There's probably, a couple of them, but you don't know like all the people who are running. Like, there's Villaraigosa, who was the former mayor of LA. There's Xavier Becerra, who was the former Health and Human Services Secretary. There's Katie Porter, who was a former congresswoman, tried to run for Senate against Adam Schiff. But none of these, I think, are like really big household names. A lot of these are like, unless you're really into California politics, you know exactly who these people are. There's Steve Hilton and Chad Bianco on the Republican side. She would probably be the biggest name to jump into the Democratic race. But I was discussing this with someone this past week about her possibly running. And it was, they brought up a good point about Kamala Harris, is that she is someone who does not like to make decisions under pressure. And that was the description of her. She is someone who does not like to make decisions under pressure. That's the entire job of being a governor or a president, which she ran for. And I think she likes the idea of being a governor because she thinks it comes with the accolades and she gets to be governor, and maybe she can run for president down the line farther when she proves herself in California. Be kind of tough to prove herself in California because I think she's even farther left than Gavin Newsom. But she's not, the numbers aren't really in her favor in terms of people are split on whether she should run or not. Yeah, Democrats would show up for her, but there's a long way to go until 2026. And all I got to say is, God help us if Kamala Harris decides to run for governor of California. That's literally the last thing we need. We've already suffered enough. Just this year, LA has seen wildfires and protests and riots and homelessness. It's just, we've seen enough already, California. I don't need to see Kamala Harris running for governor. But one thing about Kamala Harris running for governor is that if she runs, someone else has already said they're going to jump into the race, and that is Rick Grinnell. So Rick Grinnell has already said that he's going to jump into the race. Grinnell, who's a former ambassador to Germany, told Politico's Dasha Burns that if Harris chooses to run to replace Governor Gavin Newsom, that will have an influence on his own decision. Quote, I want to see if Kamala runs. If Kamala runs, I think there's a whole lot of Republicans who are going to have to take a look at it, not just me. Goes on to say, if she runs, it's going to make me have to look at it right now. I'm not running. So Rick Grinnell, another name that might jump in because of Kamala Harris. So you might get a 2-for-1. If Kamala Harris jumps in, you're going to get a Rick Grinnell who's also going to jump in. So 2026 is just going to be as dramatic and as exciting. And probably for 2026, that will be the biggest race outside of all the midterm races, is who's going to be the governor of California. You also have the governor of New Jersey. That's a big issue as well. But let me know your thoughts in the comments regarding, do you want Kamala Harris to run? Do you think she should run? I have a feeling I know what the answer is going to be, but Lord help us if Kamala Harris decides she's going to run. All right. Next story. I'm going to talk about this really quickly. So not really quickly. I want to dive into this one. This one's really interesting. You can all, for everyone, this is going to be my most, I should say, Alex Jones kind of segment here on the California Underground podcast. So brace yourselves. This is going to get pretty interesting. Scott Wiener came out this week, and he had a video, which we're going to watch in a second, where he wants to revoke all the previous calls by the California legislature for an Article 5 constitutional convention. We're going to get to what that is. I'm sure if you've heard about what a constitutional convention or an Article 5 convention of the states, you know what I'm talking about here. But basically, Scott Wiener wants to revoke all those previous calls for a constitutional convention. Let's hear what he has to say about it.
Donald Trump wants to rewrite the Constitution to strip people of their citizenship, to eliminate basic civil rights, and to cement his own power so he can stay in office for the rest of his life. In California, we are working to stop him from being able to do that. So there is something called a constitutional convention, and that's how you can rewrite the Constitution. We've never had that before in the U.S., and although there are problems with the Constitution, now is not the time to open it up for extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump and Jim Jordan to be able to do God knows what with the Constitution. It takes 34 states to call for a Constitution in order to trigger one. We are getting dangerously close to that number. And California has called for several constitutional conventions over the last century, about a half a dozen of them on different subjects. And so we don't need that risk. So I introduced a resolution. It just passed the full state Senate this week, and that'll now go to the Assembly to blanket rescind all of California's calls for a constitutional convention so that we are no longer on record as one of those potentially 34 states. So again, Constitution has problems. I would love to reform it and modernize it and make it better. I hope that there is a time when we can do that in a safe way. Now is not the time. It's not safe to do it, and California is not going to be a party to it.
I don't want to do a constitutional convention because my team is not in power. See, that's how that works. I'm all for the Constitution and amending it, not when my team's not in power. I want to guarantee the outcome and make sure that I get what I want out of a constitutional convention. So he explained right there a little bit about what a constitutional convention is. It's very odd for Scott Wiener to be talking about stuff that doesn't involve, protecting sex traffickers or something like that. I thought this was pretty interesting. So I went down. Well, first off, let's go to this. Article 5, it goes on to talk about basically how the states can do it is that three-fourths of the state legislatures can call for a constitutional convention. What happens is then they have this convention of the states and they can start proposing amendments to the Constitution. So there's two ways you can amend the Constitution. Congress can put forward an amendment, and then there's a convention of the states which can do this as well. This is what he's talking about, is that there's 34 states. They've slowly been adding states on to sign on to it. There's actually an organization called, I think, Article 5 or Convention of the States. I think Mark Levin runs it. And they are getting closer and closer to reaching that threshold to do so. And once there's a Convention of the States, it then kind of opens it up that all the states can start adding all these different amendments, which, could be good, could be bad. That's sort of the gamble you're taking is red states can start proposing a whole bunch of ideas, and then blue states are going to start proposing a whole bunch of ideas that can change the amendments. Now, this is where I'm going to put on my, this is where I'm putting on my tinfoil hat. So everyone buckle up, because I went down the rabbit hole and I was researching. It took me a while to find this. Thanks to Grok, at least I was able to narrow down what I was looking for. I was curious because I was sitting here going, I wonder what other things California has called a constitutional convention on, because there's only been like 7 calls for a California constitutional convention by California. And I was like, I wonder what else they've called for. And I know one of them is Gavin Newsom called for this gun amendment, which we're going to talk about in a second. But there was another one in 1945. And when I say I had to dig to find this, for you to know about this, I mean it. I really had to dig to find this. So this came about 1949. And let me see if I can read it, because it is really tiny. Give me 1 second. It basically says, Assembly Joint Resolution 26, Joint Resolution relative to the participation of the United States in a world federal government. right? That is right at the top there. I want to say this again. A joint resolution of the legislature of the state of California to the Committee on Foreign Relations relative to the participation of the United States in a world federal government. It goes on to say, whereas war is now a threat to the very existence of our civilization because modern science has produced weapons of war which are overwhelmingly destructive and against which there is no sure defense. Whereas the effective maintenance of world peace is the proper concern and responsibility of every American citizen. Mind you, this is 1949, so it's right after World War II. Whereas the people of the state of California, while now enjoying domestic peace and security under the laws of their local state and federal government, deeply desire the guarantee of world peace. And whereas all history shows that peace is the product of law and order, and that law and order are the product of government. Whereas the United Nations, as presently constituted, although accomplishing great good in many fields, lacks authority to enact, interpret, or enforce world law, and under its present charter is incapable of restraining any major nations which may foster or foment war. Then it goes on to say, we can keep skipping down, whereas many states have memorialized Congress through resolutions by their state legislatures or in their referenda by their voters to initiate steps towards the creation of a world federal government reserving to the nations and to the people those rights not specifically granted as necessary to the establishment and maintenance of world law order. Whereas several nations have recently adopted constitutional provisions to facilitate their entry into a world federal government by authoring a delegation to such a world federal government of a portion of their sovereignty. I want to say that again. They want to authorize a delegation to such a world government authority of a portion of their sovereignty sufficient to endow it with powers adequate to prevent war. Now therefore be it resolved by the Assembly and the Senate of the State of California. That application is hereby made to the Congress of the United States pursuant to Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States to call a convention for the sole purpose of proposing an amendment of the Constitution to expedite and ensure the participation of the United States in a world federal government open to all nations with powers which will still be limited, shall be adequate to preserve peace. I'm just gonna let that sit there for a second. I did not believe that this, when I went down farther and farther down the rabbit hole on this, I had to dig this up, right? That I had to look in congressional records. I had to look through thousands of pages to find this. Thankfully, I found something called the Friends of the Article 5 Constitution, and they actually had this much easier than I looked for, but I found it. They were proposing a world federal government back in 1949. I think I said this week to somebody on our team. I said, globalists have been at this a long time. The idea that they wanted to propose a constitutional amendment through Article 5 to enact a world federal government that we would cede some of our authority to. Some, and to me, call me crazy, but the United States ceding any authority or sovereignty to a world federal government sounds about as anti-American as I can think. And this is part of, now I don't know if Scott Wiener is smart enough to know this was part of it. I don't know if he thinks that we're going to get rid of this and we don't want people to know about this because it's memorialized. Obviously, I found a copy of it. But this is going to be part of it, so I guess they're not calling for a world federal government or that constitutional convention. They're pulling everything back now. They don't want any constitutional conventions now. So let it be known, if you ever talk to people, that California, at one time, the legislature of California, 1949, jointly, the Assembly and the State Senate, proposed amending the Constitution to create a world federal government that we would cede sovereignty and authority to. That is some scary stuff. Now, the other thing that has been put out there is Governor Gavin Newsom has pushed out this gun control constitutional amendment. Again, I know you're shocked, but it hasn't gone anywhere. Mostly because, as we know with Gavin Newsom, anything he does is mostly just for his presidential run in 2028. This is all just for show. From Cal Matters, they say even as Newsom continues to tout the effort, largely through social media advertisements that encourage people to sign a petition and donate to his political action committee, it appears to have gained little traction outside of California. Legislative leaders in several other large states controlled by Democrats told Cal Matters that calling for a constitutional convention to adopt the amendment has not come up for discussion among their caucuses. Quote, they've come out of the closet. They've showed their true intent. They want to eradicate the Second Amendment, period, said Alan Gottleby, founder and executive vice president of the Second Amendment Foundation, which has repeatedly sued to overturn gun restrictions in California. Quote, he's staking out his territory for Democratic primaries for running for the White House in the future. He's trying to take that mantle so that other candidates can't claim to be the most anti-gun candidate. Well, I don't know if Scott Wiener conferred with Gavin Newsom. I don't know if Gavin Newsom signed off on the fact that they're trying to revoke basically everything that he is trying to do and pull his gun control amendment away from him. But that's the type of calls for constitutional amendments we have coming out of California. A one world federal government and massive gun control. So just to give you an idea of how California wants to change the Constitution. And when Scott Wiener says, I hope there's a day that we can do this and modernize the Constitution, you know, that's just a sneak peek of what they would like to do when they get their chance to modernize the Constitution. All right. Let's check out the chat for a second before we get to our final story. Everyone, thanks for tuning in wherever you are. YouTube, Instagram, Rumble, everywhere. Everyone's chatting, having a good time. Thank you for tuning in live. Somebody said something about pollution. I think that was a front. There's something else because China doesn't do anything about climate or pollution. Right. We're like a drop in the bucket when it comes to that stuff. So there's some other comments in here. I cannot repeat on here. All right. So final story of the night, and we'll get back to your chats and questions after that. Let's see. Make sure we pull this up. All right. Do we have another French Laundry moment on our hands? We all know the famous French Laundry moment. Gavin Newsom, right in the peak COVID time when everything was shut down in 2020, when nobody could go to a restaurant, was photographed sitting at the French Laundry enjoying a opulent meal paid for by one of his best friends who was an oil and gas lobbyist, Jason Kinney. So look that up. Now we have a new, I think, French Laundry example of Gavin Newsom. So this story came out this past weekend about what was Gavin Newsom up to when LA started to see riots and protests. Where was he? Why was he not ready for this? Why did he not do what he had to do? Why did he not act as quickly? And this goes back to the whole thing about the lawsuit with the National Guard. So a story came out from the City Journal that says, a source who photographed Newsom at the event expressed shock that the governor was in attendance. Given that riots had broken out in Los Angeles the day before, I couldn't believe it, the source said. He was just walking around like this on an everyday occurrence. Newsom was at the wine party for at least 90 minutes, according to a source who said that when the governor finally left, he appeared to retreat to the inner rooms of his winery. The timeline is worth noting. The Los Angeles riots broke out on June 6 in a response to the Trump administration's illegal alien deportation policies as Newsom sampled wines in Napa Valley. the next day, rioters in Los Angeles had already begun vandalizing public buildings, barricading streets, setting vehicles on fire, throwing rocks, bottles, and cinder blocks at law enforcement officers. That evening, after the wine party had finished, President Trump authorized the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to California, saying that they were needed to address the lawlessness. So, that's an important question. Gavin Newsom, what were you up to? And we know. Now we know what happened and where he was. He was at an event. It was called Vineyard Vibes or something like that. It's for his sister's nonprofit called Plump Jack Foundation, which I looked it up. She works a total of like 2 hours for. And it looks like it's a good cause. It's for breast cancer research and stuff like that. But it was a exclusive event where you had to pay like $150 ticket, out of the price range of most people. It was a fancy wine event with food and wine at one of his Plump Jack wineries. Mind you, he still owns these Plump Jack wineries. I guess it's in a blind trust now. But to go back to the lawsuit that he is currently fighting right now, the court in that lawsuit had noted that there was a lack of action between June 6th and June 7th, which opened the door for President Trump to federalize the National Guard. And that quote from that story right there is very important to point out, because between June 6th and June 7th, riots started to build. They started to get more out of control and nothing was being done. So while LA was seeing worse and worse riots and protests over the weekend of June 7th, you had Gavin Newsom up at one of his wineries, sipping wine, having a great time, not doing anything. Nothing was done. No National Guard, no extra help, nothing like that. And then finally on the evening of June 7th was when President Trump said, look, our federal agents are under attack. Our federal property is under attack. We need to do something here to protect our federal buildings and our federal personnel. I'm the commander in chief. I'm the head of the federal government. I have to do something. So he called up the National Guard. So now Newsom is whining about the fact that he didn't act fast enough to send the National Guard himself and be, the head Mr. Machismo leader. And instead, President Trump stepped in and stole that from him, usurped that authority from him, and made him look weak. All because he was at this event sipping wine for the benefit of his sister. Like, this is another French Laundry moment in my eyes. And I know that they said they photographed him. That photograph is going to be part of the opposition research and opposition campaign ads for whoever runs against Gavin Newsom in 2028. Mark my words, it's going to be the French Laundry and this picture of, when COVID was happening and restaurants were all closed, here's Gavin Newsom in the French Laundry. Now it's going to be when LA was seeing protests and riots and violence over this weekend, June 7th. Where was Gavin Newsom? He was at a winery, sipping wine, having a good time. And that's going to be the thing, is that he is not a leader when it really counts. He's not the man who's going to, when things get tough, he's not the man who's actually going to show up. There was an old commercial or an old ad. You can look it up on Google or YouTube. Something about who's going to pick up the phone at 3 a.m. It's an older ad, and it's literally the red phone is just ringing. It's 3 a.m. in the morning. And the question is, who do you want picking up the phone at 3 a.m. in the morning? And that's always sort of been the question for presidents who are running. Do you want this guy picking up the phone at 3 a.m.? Do you trust, when everybody else is asleep and no one knows what's going on, that you trust who's going to be in charge when it all hits the fan? And that's not Gavin Newsom. Because when COVID happened and everybody else was locked down, he was going to the French Laundry. He was sending his kids to private school when everybody else had to do Zoom school. He's going to a fancy winery event when LA is facing protests and riots, and LAPD officers are being put in danger because they can't handle the crowds and are being completely overwhelmed by all the chaos and violence. He was too busy. He was too busy up in Napa Valley having a good time. And that's going to be the question for Gavin Newsom, and probably his Achilles heel. Not just the homelessness, not just the crime, not just the economy and the taxes and the gas prices. All that stuff is going to contribute. I'm not going to sit here and say it's not going to contribute to opposition ads against Gavin Newsom. I'm just saying this, that at the end of the day, people vote for who's going to be picking up that phone at 3 a.m. And if they keep pushing this image that Gavin Newsom was not caring about you and only caring about himself when times were really tough, that's a losing argument. That's a losing point for Gavin Newsom. And that is a major losing point on top of everything else of why he can't be president. So we have Kamala Harris, who is seriously considering running for governor of California. And then we have Gavin Newsom, who we know is seriously running for president of the United States. We know he keeps saying he's not thinking about it. He's absolutely 100,000% thinking about it. So, all right. Got a couple minutes here. I want to get to some comments. Everybody who is jumping in live, thank you, everybody. Gavin is the commander-in-chief of the state guards and firefighters, and he didn't deploy his National Guard during the LA fire. Yeah, he didn't do that either. He acted super quickly filing lawsuits with our monies. Yeah, that's 100% true as well. Yeah, he's very quick. Him and Rob Bonta are very quick about filing lawsuits. I don't think President Trump sleeps it well. I don't know how he does it. The man is almost 80 years old. I think he gets 4 hours of sleep, which is unbelievable. Let's see. It's seriously just a problem with Democrats. Where was Newsom for the riots? Where was Karen Bass during the LA fires? Where was Joe Biden literally his whole presidency? Yeah, that's Kamala Harris in a nutshell. Is she doesn't want to make tough decisions when the pressure's on. So it matters who casts a vote and only Stalin. That's a great quote. All right. Gavin Newsom is very incompetent. He's delusional. Think he could win the race for president. Well, he's got an ego. I will say that. He's definitely got an ego, and he thinks he can run for president. He thinks he's basically, if you know any history about Gavin Newsom, you will know that he's basically been the anointed one for a long time, ever since Willie Brown appointed him to some obscure seat in San Francisco. He's been the anointed one in California politics for a very long time. So when you go through decades of being the anointed one and basically you keep winning your way up, you get sort of delusions of grandeur that you should be president someday and that you're going to be president someday. All right. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, everybody for tuning in live. Thanks for checking us out. Hopefully you like the 8:00 start time. Everybody, what was I going to say? Everybody who tuned in, thank you for everything and making sure you hit Make sure you hit like, share, subscribe, review, all that stuff that helps with the algorithm. And the best thing that you can do to support the show that is 100% free. You can also check out our nice Local Elections Matter shirt. That's on our shop. If you go to Instagram, you can check that out. But also, if you want to help us out, 100% free, you can share this show with someone who you think would get a kick out of it or would find this very interesting. And with that, we will see you on the next one. Have a good one.